Okay, so Q5, we're starting to get into the, in a way, the easier to understand pieces of the semester. So if what we've been doing so far has been challenging, my understanding from experience is that here on out is a little bit better, which is nice because now we're getting to the second half of the semester and I'm sure other classes are ramping up a little bit. So question 5 is about the roles of explicit and implicit learning in SLA. Before we talk about what that means a little bit, uh, I will mention they're of course the same three positions, except for it's framed as is key, right? Implicit learning is key in second language acquisition, as in the idea of the word key here is like it drives acquisition. It's sort of the engine, you know. There's a second position, explicit learning is key, and of course both are important is the third possibility, of course. Okay. Now implicit learning. Implicit means below the level of awareness, right? So something that would be implicit, for example, would be um, so if I mean, anything that you do without being consciously aware of. I mean, there's something called proceduralization, which is to say where you learn to do something by practice, and we'll return to it later in this particular lesson, actually, in which something becomes below the level of consciousness because you practice it so many times. In some sense, it's like it's implicit knowledge, right? So like you might learn explicitly to drive a car and then implicitly later you employ that knowledge. You're not like actively thinking, yes, and now I will shift gears or I mean, we don't shift gears anymore, but yeah, most of us anyway. I don't know. I will press the gas harder. I don't know. There's some very explicit things that happen in the initial stages of learn to drive that aren't necessary later on. Um, And so these are the implicit things, the things that we don't think about anymore. So this position that says implicit learning is key in second language acquisition is, as you can see in front of you, a largely favored approach. Van Pat was pretty clear about this too. And what that would mean is SLA is driven by implicit learning. The things that we're not aware of is actually what's building our linguistic system. At its core of this is Krashen's monitor theory. And we've mentioned Krashen a couple times coming up. But when it gets into implicit learning and input, Krashen becomes suddenly extremely important. And input's going to show up in Q6, so to be returned, to be continued. Another implicit driving SLA is sort of the old school Van Patten UG approach. And I mean this to say that, so Van Patten, one of our authors, he has gone through several phases in the second language sphere. He's actually left to go do stand-up comedy and write books because why not? I actually just saw a keynote. He came back to give a keynote at a conference recently on pedagogy, actually, in L2, and run by a bunch of his former students. And he's basically the same guy, except for now that he's left the field, he can gossip, which is delightful and strange. But anyway, the old school Van Patten approach is that SLA is all input, right? It's kind of it's a cousin of Krashen's monitor theory in that sense. But, you know, his idea was always input, 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 input. And you don't have to explicitly make somebody do information explicitly, learn it explicitly. And this kind of tied back into kind of an avoidance of production in the classroom, like output of any kind. But this is back, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this. And there are other universal grammar approaches, such as you see, there's a book by Lydia White from 2003 that, you know, it hasn't really been replaced very much since then. But I mean, there's papers that comment on these themes. But as far as the broad strokes of the universal grammar approach to second language acquisition, this book is kind of still very foundational, you know, even if the details are slightly different now in our understanding. And so all of these ones should say that SLA is implicit in nature. There's another one that we'll talk a little bit detail about too. It's called connectionism. When we talk about UG towards the end of the course, connectionism is what we're going to compare it to. It's the leading, well, it falls in the umbrella of emergentism, actually. It's sort of the leading counter proposal to UG in L2. And in fact, some of those people think it happens in child acquisition. So, but, you know, and so we'll talk a little bit about what that would mean for implicit learning, so a non-UG approach to implicit learning. But before they do that, let's talk for a second from sort of a pedagogical, a teaching point of view. So if I say to you, this classroom uses implicit learning, what could that mean? There are ways that you can turn a traditional second language classroom into an implicit learning environment. And so some of it could be just I give you lots and lots and lots of input. I expose you, expose you, and you try to absorb it. Or if I'm trying to actually make you notice things, to like absorb information, I could use input enhancement. And this is a vocab term from the book. So you're responsible for knowing what this is and being able to define it, or at least choose it out of the lineup. But that's the idea behind input enhancement, is that you're giving someone input, right? So like a sentence or whatever in the target language, in whatever modality is appropriate for the language that you're learning. And you give emphasis to some piece of it in order to draw attention to it without explaining why it matters. So if you were learning English, one way to do it would be for me to imagine we were talking about that S that's so hard to notice. And we argued that the morpheme S in the third person singular present tense, as in John walks to the store, we argued that that was one of the last things to be learned. And let's imagine as a teacher, I'm trying to help my students. Again, does that help? Debatable. But let's say that that's my plan. I want them to potentially notice it exists, increases its salience. I use input enhancement, which in this case can be anything from, I don't know, I'm saying the sentence and I emphasize this, like I did when I was trying to make my example clear to you. John walks. I'm using my finger. I'm changing. I'm pausing. I'm like changing my body posture. Walks. You can do that with sign languages too. You could emphasize kind of with the body. Again, me not knowing sign language, it's hard for me to give you an example, but if you do know some sign language, you can envision this, right? There are ways to emphasize. There are in any language, and then if it's written, of course, you can change colors and bold and underline and so on and so forth, right? So this would be drawing attention to something, increasing the salience intentionally of something. Potentially, too, you could increase its frequency if you just give them a whole bunch of examples of something, right? Other ways to use implicit information to show people things to help them learn could be illustrations and photos. So if I'm trying to teach you something related to, so again, imagine that let's imagine I'm teaching you irregular past tense in English, right? And so I want to teach you swam. And so I show a picture of, I don't know, the calendar. I show it's today, and I show John swimming, and I say John swims. Cool. And then I show, yesterday's date or something, and I show John swimming. I write yesterday, and it shows him swimming, and then I say John swam, and your brain goes, well, past tense sounds different. He's still swimming. That must be the past tense of swam, right? So you can use illustrations and photos to do the same thing, teach something implicitly. If you've ever played around with Rosetta Stone, which is not as terrible as many other choices for, electronic learning services, it very much functions in the implicit, right? I've played around with it when I was trying to learn Korean, and it does input enhancement, like it'll bold stuff and turn it red. It'll use pictures. It'll use contrasting images. It's very much in this vein. And me as a researcher go, actually, it's not too bad. They also use production, which is a different thing. But anywho, so these are ways to do implicit. Notice that none of my examples have me going, guess what? The past tense of swim is swam. Or me being like, guess what? That S at the end of the walk, I mark that because John is a third person. Right? So this is implicit information. And there are other options as well, but these are the major ones. The other ones would depend on the language and depend on the grammar point and so on and so forth. Now, monitor theory, as we said, was one of the major proposals that said that implicit information was driving acquisition. And so let's talk a little bit more about what that means, okay? Monitor theory has acquisition and learning as distinct things. And you may or may not go be like, what? If you read, you might already know the answer to this, but it's important to think, how could learning and acquisition be different? Now, learning is a word that we use for lots of stuff, right? I can learn someone's name. I did not acquire their name, which means learning is a conscious process in some sense, right? It's things that we're aware of. I learn facts. I acquire, I don't know, a skill. right? I acquire knowledge in second language, which is it's suggesting it is under the surface. So as it says here, L2 learning is knowledge you know explicitly. Acquisition is what you know implicitly. You can't necessarily put a name to it. And so the prediction of monitor theory, among other things, because it's in the back of your book, it's got different parts. But the biggest one is that in monitor theory, it says you can only use implicit knowledge in real time. So let's imagine that I teach you in a classroom that John walks because he's third person and singular in the present tense. He has an S on the end of his verb. Bam! I could teach you that. I could teach you that rule, and that would be learning in monitor theory. But if you haven't acquired it, if you haven't had enough input and examples that your brain goes, oh, I guess I really need that, right? Even if you don't have a phonological problem like we talked about, even if you've learned it and you understand it, if you only learned it explicitly, right? If you know it as a fact, but it's not part of your linguistic system, when you're in the middle of, production, or if you're writing quickly, for example, because writing slowly is a different thing, right? You have time to go, hey, guess what? That's right. I'll fix that, editing time. If you're doing something quickly or speaking or signing or whatever, it's English, so we're not signing in this case, but whatever, you wouldn't have time to access that explicit knowledge. You just couldn't get that S out in time. And this is what monitor theory suggests is the shortcoming of explicit information, is that it requires time to access it. Whereas implicit knowledge, things that we've acquired, are just there, This is the distinction, okay? Now the UG, the simplified version of the story is this. If UG is available in second language acquisition, as some of us would say, right, implicit learning could be enough because it works in child acquisition, right? So a learner would use input and UG and go through their options, and they would potentially reset their parameters and acquire lexica and so on and so forth. Lexical items, I guess, not lexica. Lexica is multiple lexicons, but anyway, lexical items. And so what you would, this particular proposal would say that it would be enough, and this is kind of what Van Patten was getting at, it would be enough if you had all of UG and no impediments whatsoever, and input would be enough to reset those parameters. The story is a little more complicated than that in reality, but this is a particular way of approaching this problem. Now, we did talk a little bit about external factors, the question of whether instruction matters, and so on and so forth, but definitely there's personality. Personality is not like inside your UG, so there's a question as to how that figures in, right? But this would be a particular way of explaining implicit driving SLA. Now, connectionism, as I mentioned, is a different one. Connectionism is a non-UG approach to learning, okay? Connectionism specifically believes that learning is a process, and acquisition, I guess you could say. Acquisition is a process of associations in the brain. Connectionism doesn't bother to make that distinction. That's a Krashen thing, particularly. So what they're saying is that as you are exposed to language, implicitly, you have unconscious processing. Your brain's going, oh, I guess there's associations. There's a frequency relationship between, I don't know, John and walks, for example, right? Or other third-person singular subjects and walks. And we go, those tend to co-occur. And so as you're processing it without thinking about it too much, your brain starts making an unconscious tabulation using frequency. Tabulation is kind of like I make a table and say, well, this is how many times it showed up with it, and these how many times it showed up without it. And so you would have like a frequency measure of some kind. And in connectionism, this is what's driving acquisition, is that I have some kind of sensitivity to co-occurrence, right? And so here's a quote from Nick Ellis, not Rod Ellis, Nick Ellis, 2005, who says, the bulk of language acquisition is implicit learning from usage. So a lot of times this gets associated with what they call usage-based acquisition models. Most knowledge is tacit knowledge, meaning unaware. Tacit's like silent or unaware. Most learning is implicit. So this is a direct quote from one of the big shots in connectionism. Okay, so under connectionism, where you're talking about frequency and tabulation, they also talk about reliability of cues, but we will get back to connectionism towards the end of the semester. Then it would be implicit, right? Because me telling you a rule would not change the unconscious tabulation of frequency. Okay. So explicit is key. This is a very short section because it is only hypothetical. No one would argue that explicit learning is what drives acquisition, right? Because of the reasons we said before, I can know a rule. I can study a rule and understand it consciously and have it have absolutely no bearing on my language use. This is what happens time and time and time again. Many second language classrooms are explicit driven and they'll teach you the rules and maybe they'll give you worksheets or they'll ask you to write something when you sit there with your dictionary and your book and whatever. And then it comes around to it and they're like, great, do it. And you go, I can't do this. I'm sorry. You know? And I mean, the way that signed languages are taught many times is, I mean, in a good school like USM, a good ASL school, like USM, a lot of it's, immersion and implicit, not all of it, but a lot of it is. It's very input driven, where, I mean, so even ASL, for example, people might go, okay, in ASL, the word order is blah, 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 right? But it's not the case that you could ever go from I teach you the rules of ASL, again, just an example, into suddenly I can sign. There's a huge leap between those two things. Ergo, this is a hypothetical position. Explicit processes are described as cumbersome. They're heavy. They're inefficient, right? And so what would it even mean truly to learn explicitly? It would suggest that I've learned a rule and suddenly it's useful to me. And so by extension, the question would be, what would it take to use explicit knowledge during communication? It would take time? I don't know. You'd have to have the ability to sit there and someone asks you a question, you go, okay, hang on, write it down, think about it, look up a word, write a response, read it again, add the right morphemes, and then say it. That's about the extent it would take to really, truly use explicit knowledge during communication. It would just be a complete roadblock, frankly. Okay, so modern SLA theories, by extension, don't propose that explicit only is sufficient. Okay, they propose, generally speaking, that both implicit and explicit work together. That is to say, purely implicit models, by and large, are not popular for reasons we're about to talk about, but they do exist, and they're better supported than explicit only because no one strictly claims that explicit drives, acquisition. No one believes that, okay? But that they co-occur, yes, people do believe this. A major theory under this umbrella that both explicit and implicit information are important is something called skill acquisition theory, which involves proceduralization, as I'll about to define for you in a second, by Robert de Keyser. And it's a cousin of the declarative procedural model. If you look in the second kind of, well, I guess it's like the middle part of our book, because we have like a 9-question section, a theory section, and then we have all the terminology at the end. That middle section of theories includes UG, connectionism, skill acquisition theory, declarative procedural model. It has lots of things. If you flip through it, you'll discover there's a lot of theories about language. And when I say that in this class it's irresponsible for me to only talk about UG, it's because if you look in there, only one of those is explicitly the UG approach. There are several more, although some of them are compatible between them. It's like skill theory, to a point, is compatible with UG, to a point. Ergo, it's, even if you believe in UG, even if that is your framework of understanding language, as I would hope that your knowledge of syntax would make it impossible to believe it's not impossible to not believe in it. I really hope that that has been impressed upon you because there's no way to explain the facts of syntax without UG. And I'm very sorry to any functionalist you ever meet, but this is true. You cannot explain the facts of syntax with just function. It has to have underlying form, which is what UG tells you. Okay, so skill theory and proceduralization, also called skill acquisition theory, claims that explicit knowledge is not the only way to make implicit knowledge, but it can turn into implicit knowledge. And I think this is what we're banking on in a lot of classrooms, right? Which is to say that you learn the rules and they eventually turn into skills. And the idea is that you practice. Okay, in particular, you proceduralize them. And so this proposal proceduralization goes as follows. A teacher teaches a form with an explanation. So I go, okay, cool, this third person singular verb in English needs an S in the present tense. Cool. And then you practice it. John walks, Mary walks, Susie walks, Valencia walks, I don't know, whoever. You practice, 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 and then boop, practice makes perfect, I mean, depending on what you're studying, is unrealistic. But to a point, it's what we're banking on in a classroom, I would say, on average. My personal opinion's a little more complex than this too. Delightful that everything's complex, but it's fine. But this is the idea, is that you can proceduralize, you can turn it into like a habit. Proceduralization is kind of a habit forming process. That's the idea, that you've turned it into a habit, this ability to use a particular form. That's kind of what this is going for. It's a skill acquisition. It's a proceduralization. Okay? Okay. Noticing theory is another version of this, and I think noticing theory honestly is agnostic in terms of whether or not there's UG, because I don't find a lot of counter evidence to noticing theory. It's kind of one of those truisms. Now Schmidt, I'm trying to think of his first name, I don't recall. It's fine. Robert or something like that. Schmidt said that, becoming aware of rules in otherwise implicit learning or an input is a healthy and helpful first step in some cases, right? And again, all of these do not say you can't learn implicitly. It's just that some things are tough to learn implicitly. So, so what Schmidt is arguing, that if you become aware of something, even without having like a full-blown rule for it, it's easier for your brain to use that information. So once you notice it, implicit learning takes over. And so it's something like, if I was listening to a bunch of input and, I wasn't even noticing that S, because remember, it's not very salient, it's hard to notice. I just never acquired it because I didn't even realize it was there. And then one day someone like hesitates for a little too long on the S and they go, hang on, that person put a S at the end of that verb. Hang on a second. And then I start paying attention. Now, whether or not I form a rule, like I choose a rule for this or not, is irrelevant. Noticing theory would propose that me noticing it exists is a catalyst, right? It allows me to pay attention to it, and then implicit learning can take over. That is noticing theory. So it goes something like this. Learners exposed to a heck ton of input, they notice it's something like a verbal morpheme or a funny word vocabulary term, and then their grammatical system starts absorbing that thing that they noticed. And eventually it turns into actual knowledge, okay? That's what noticing theory would say. Okay. Now, at this point, we're going to look at the authors of our book and their assessment of this question, and I'm sure by now you have a pretty good idea what they think. But I will say that, let's talk about theirs, and then I'll tell you mine in a second. So what Van Patten and Bonatti said was, if competence, and that's mental knowledge, right? My knowledge of grammar, that I can have intuitions and use it, right? If it's more than just knowledge of rules, right, then explicit isn't sufficient. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Sometimes the things that we can do in a language we can't put into words. Clearly that's true in English. And if you don't realize that, you have to tell me, why is it that you know for a fact that I believe John to run a mile is truly terrible, but I believe John to be intelligent is okay. It's not your favorite, but it's better than I believe John to run a mile. And you have no idea why that is, okay? So it can't just be rules. Something else is going on in there. Ergo, explicit can't be sufficient. And on this point, I agree with Van Patten and Bonatti. I don't think anyone would claim explicit information is sufficient. Now so as I said, my example showed you a bad sentence and said, this is bad and you don't know why. This is exactly what they're saying. Competence includes knowing what's not good in the language. And a lot of times they don't clearly tell you what's not good. I mean, you might say, do this, and then it's hard there's exceptions, really subtle exceptions that you don't realize. So learners do show knowledge of things that were bad that they were never told about. Here's another example. Something like, who did John meet the guy who saw? And the real question is, what is this supposed to mean? And it's something like, imagine the sentence, John met the guy who saw Pedro. And then and you said it really, I don't know, poorly. And instead of using an echo question, I want to ask about Pedro. And I go, who did John meet the guy who saw? You can't do that. That's not actually a good sentence or question or whatever. And no one will ever teach you that in a classroom. Clearly no one sat me down as a kid and taught me that. And again, it's just, this is subtly different from other sentences that are completely fine. And even frequency wouldn't explain that to you, okay? All right. So this sort of final is the same idea. Lots of evidence of learners knowing things that they've never been taught and they've never practiced, right? There's sources in Van Patten and Bonatti, although they could have added more. The paper I've told you about has some of that examples. Specifically, it's things about John and the run and the mile and that sort of stuff. Kind of also, if we zoom out slightly from a pedagogical point of view, a lot of people who research this sort of stuff would say that explicit knowledge, even even to the extent that it's not useful, it's also sort of it's a grapple. It's like a handhold for people, something to hang on to. So even if I don't think teaching someone the rules is always helpful, I don't think it's always helpful. But even if I feel that way, the truth is that, it has an interaction with students' affect, with their emotional state, and sometimes personality. There are people it drives them absolutely nuts for me not to tell you the rule the best as I can explain it, even if in reality it's not useful to them. They don't feel like it's not useful. They feel like it is useful. But there's a difference between I feel better knowing and I can actually use it in real time. And so all of this being said, me as an instructor, for example, I will always teach my students the rules if they ask me, even if I don't think it's always helpful, because one, it could cause noticing, cool. And two, for the emotional state, it usually makes a difference. It's usually something that if someone has a desire to know and you don't tell them, it will disrupt them to the point that they can't function. They will get so frustrated that they will never learn another thing from you. So there's always that, right? So again, I don't necessarily think that certainly explicit does not drive acquisition. I have questions about how useful it is, although I accept noticing. Sure, that seems totally reasonable to me. But I will always give explicit information because of the emotional state of my students. And me as a learner, I also like rules. So I think that that's a very common thing. Okay, here's the works cited. Let me know if you have any questions and see you in class.